Good morning, and thanks for joining us to talk about our proposed climate disclosure rules. So we've published National Instrument 51107, Disclosure of Climate-Related Matters, and that's what we'll talk a little bit more about this morning. I'd first like to introduce my colleagues. So Craig Burns, who is a colleague in our energy group, will speak for a few minutes on GHG emissions. And Amanda Kousinouris is with me in the corporate finance group. She's going to watch for questions. I'd like to encourage you to ask questions throughout. Amanda will watch and she'll ask the question at the right time as we work through the show. And you can use that Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And I'm Tanya Fleming. I'm a lawyer in the corporate finance group, and I'm a member of the team of people representing securities regulators across Canada who've been working on these proposed climate disclosure rules. As part of the work that we've done, we've been meeting with Alberta companies to talk about what we're thinking in terms of the proposed rules, listen to their feedback, and certainly a lot of that feedback is reflected in what you see here today. So here, the standard disclaimer, of course, that the views expressed are those of the presenters. But importantly, an important disclaimer is that we're going to talk about the proposed rules. These are not the final rules. And it is very likely that the final version of these rules will look a bit different than what we talk about today. Comments are really important at this step in our process. So these rules have been published for comment. And if you've participated in an earlier version of this seminar, the one piece of new information here is that comment period has been extended. We had originally put the comments out for a 90-day comment period, and that's been extended for an additional 30 days. So comments are now due February 16th. So in terms of our agenda, just to give a bit of a roadmap, before we talk too much about the proposed rule itself, I'll just set the stage by talking about some international initiatives on climate-related disclosure. Craig will then provide a bit of information on greenhouse gas emissions, and then we'll look at the proposed disclosure requirements. We'll look at some disclosure reviews that we had done earlier in the year, just a bit of information on where issuers are at currently, and then look at the proposed requirements and take any additional questions at the end. So first of all, the ASC's mandate is it's to protect investors and to foster a fair and efficient capital market. We try to be a practical, intelligent regulator, and we work hard at striking the right balance in our approach to new law. We know that investors are increasingly focused on climate-related risks, and we know that companies are responding to those risks. They're doing that now by way of voluntary reports. So they're reports that are outside of the securities regulatory regime. Things like ESG reports, sustainability reports, sometimes you'll see standalone climate reports. And our Alberta companies are absolute leaders in terms of climate disclosure. There's fantastic disclosure on a voluntary basis that's currently out. That is in response to questions from investors about climate-related matters. A bit of background, the work on the requirements for these proposed rules is an initiative of the Canadian Securities Administrators. It's been co-led between the Alberta Securities Commission and the Ontario Securities Commission, but every single jurisdiction in Canada is at the table. And coming out with a harmonized rule was very important to us. Most of our Alberta companies are subject to securities laws in multiple provinces. So it's just, purely practical standpoint, it makes sense when securities law is aligned across the country. This particular rule is really important to our Alberta companies. We're a capital market with deep expertise in energy. and also in energy transition. So with this rule, we want to get it right. We want to hit the mark. We want to respond to the investor needs and align with the international developments, but we are also cognizant of regulatory burden and the additional costs that our companies will bear when they respond to these new climate disclosure rules. And of course, Alberta companies come in all shapes and sizes. Our largest issuers are absolutely leading the way when it comes to climate-related disclosure, but some of our smaller issuers just haven't started down this path yet. And it may not be that they don't think it's important, but they have very real resource constraints when it comes to responding to new law. So we are certainly cognizant of that. So this proposed rule is, of course, it's in a consultation period. And we just so strongly want to hear from you. We have a process of receiving comments in writing. And as I said, that comment period has been extended to February 16th. And actually, Amanda was going to ask me questions, but I have a question for Amanda, if you don't mind. Amanda, how do you have a sense now of how many comments have been received by the CSA, and a sense of kind of where we're at in terms of Alberta issuers?
So as of yesterday, there were 42 comment letters actually, and they're all posted on the OSC website. And I think there were roughly 7 Alberta issuers that have already posted a comment.
Okay, that's good. That's excellent. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. On to the next slide, please. So in terms of applicability and transition, so this proposed instrument will apply to virtually all of our reporting issuers, so all of our companies. And I am personally concerned that some of our small issuers that are outside of the oil and gas industry don't have a strong awareness of this proposed rule, and perhaps don't realize that it will apply to them. So, getting that word out that these new climate related rules will apply across the industry to virtually all Alberta reporting issuers, I think that's an important message to be sure that people understand. There is a transition period that's proposed for these proposed rules. So it would be phased in over a 1-year period for non-venture issuers and a 3-year period for venture issuers. And just as an example, so if someone's listed on the TSX and they have a December 31st year end, the first filings that would contain this disclosure would be due in March of 2024. So it applies to their financial year that ends December 31st, 2023. And then you'd make those filings in March of 2024. Oh, and the one other comment I wanted just to say there is that when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, the data collection systems would need to be in place by January 1st, 2023, so that you can gather that data for the full 2023 year and then be able to report it. And so while this rule is just proposed now, for issuers that haven't yet set up data collection systems to get an understanding of their GHG emissions, that may be useful to do that now while the rule is still in its comment period before it actually comes into law. So turning a bit now to international initiatives, our proposed rules, they align with the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which we call TCFD. So TCFD back in 2015, the International Stability Board established this task force to develop recommendations for effective climate-related disclosure. 2017, TCFD released those recommendations, provided a framework. Those recommendations were then updated by an annex that was published in October of 2021. which reflects the evolution of disclosure practices. And also in 2021, TCFD published a status report indicating it has over 2,600 supporting organizations globally. So TCFD is, they have done a lot of work in the background in terms of climate-related disclosures. They have a very solid framework, and we have aligned our proposed rules with the TCFD recommendations. And in terms of initiatives from other security regulators, the CSA, the Canadian Securities Administrators, are among the first security regulators in the world to publish our climate disclosure rules for comment. We're not the first, but we are in the first group. The UK is ahead of us. They have had TCFD aligned disclosure requirements for their premium listed companies. They're very large issuers. And those requirements apply for accounting periods that begin on or after January 1st, 2021. So you'll see the first reports published in the spring of 2022. So happening right away, we'll start to see those reports from the large UK companies. The US, of course, we are watching, and we are so interested to see their proposed climate-related rules. Of course, there was a huge shift when Biden came into office. They rejoined the Paris Accord on his first day. The SEC has said that disclosure related to climate is a priority, and they have said that we can expect to see their climate-related disclosure rules earlier in 2022. So we're watching for that. And of course, I mean, there's so much integration in our capital markets. We will be very interested to see the rules of the SEC. We have heard that those rules will be aligned with TCFD, so we don't anticipate that what we've proposed will be wildly different. But we're certainly interested. And other jurisdictions as well have really aligned around TCFD in requiring reporting on climate-related matters. So, and some other international initiatives that I just wanted to touch on, the International Reporting, so IFRS Foundation, they have developed an International Sustainability Standards Board, which is a new international organization that's developed to form disclosure standards. There will be offices of that organization in Montreal, Quebec, and also Frankfurt, Germany. And then in November of 2021, in order to provide recommendations to this new International Sustainability Standards Board, IFRS published two prototypes, the climate-related disclosures prototype and the general requirements for disclosure of sustainability-related financial information. And that was published during COP26, which is the United Nations Climate Change Conference. It was just after our rules came out, and we knew that would happen because there was lots of developments in terms of climate-related disclosure that were happening right around that same time.
Sonia, I have a quick question from an audience member. Now that the IFRS climate prototype has been published, has the CSA looked at whether their proposed rules are consistent with the IFRS proposed rules on climate?
Yeah, we have certainly looked at that. Our rules came out just a bit before that. We published in October, and IFRS came out with these two prototypes in November. So both our rule and the prototype are TCFD based. So fundamentally, they're aligned around that TCFD framework. The CSA rules are more general in nature. We'll talk about them more, but as we walk through and you kind of see what we're asking, they're quite general framework type questions. And when you look at those prototypes, they're quite detailed. They're certainly a lot more detailed than the CSA rules. You know, I just know, if I'm just thinking, if I was the one that was preparing the disclosure and I was looking at responding to the new rules put out by the CSA, I would find it useful, I think, in referring to those prototypes and saying, okay, what are some examples of what the IFRS Foundation thinks should be disclosed under these headings. So I think, I mean, they seem like they work well together. They're certainly not inconsistent because they're both based on that same TCFD framework. And at this point, I'll actually turn it over to Craig, who'll give you a bit of update on GHG emissions.
Excellent, thank you, Tanya. Just to start off here, I'm going to put a bit of a plug in for our upcoming energy session, because we're going to be talking about greenhouse gas emissions and the various scopes and some of the work that we've been doing on that stuff. So please stay tuned for that. So when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions in these scopes, just keep in mind that regardless of the reporting framework we're talking about, whether it be GRI, SASB, TCFD, et cetera, one of the common threads is that they categorize emissions by scope. And these emissions aren't limited to just carbon dioxide. So there's the carbon dioxide equivalents, which includes such things as methane. When we're talking about scope 1, we're talking about the direct emissions that are owned or controlled by a particular reporting issuer. What I would think about maybe for an example of this, if you think about maybe something that people can relate to that would be participating in this today, say a refinery. If you're a company that has refining operations and you are producing refined products, the emissions that are associated with the refinery that go into producing those refined products, we would call those emissions Scope 1 emissions. So Scope 2 emissions are the indirect emissions. Think of this with our refinery example. Let's think about purchase of electricity that's used by that refinery to create those refined products. So those emissions are generated through the production of electricity by a different party that's unrelated or uncontrolled by the reporting issuer that we're talking about that owns the refinery. Those would be Scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are all other indirect emissions that occur somewhere in the value chain upstream or downstream. And what I would say here, think about say a company that trucks away the refined product from that refinery to the end user, and that the company that owns those trucks, unrelated to the reporting issuer. I think the emissions that come from that trucking. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about if you're unfamiliar with the various scopes. So we'll just move on to the next slide here. So we know that the proposed NI 51107 points towards the greenhouse gas protocol as the global standard. Think of this a little bit like with 51101, and we have the COGI handbook as a technical standard. So in this case, though, the greenhouse gas protocol is to be used, or an equivalent is to be used for the disclosure under 51107. We've included a graphic here that hopefully gives you a little bit of an illustration of the scopes that we just talked about in the preceding slide, maybe help you understand a little bit of what we mean by scopes 1, 2, and 3. So that's it. Back to you, Tanya.
There we go. Thank you very much, Greg. Okay, so looking at what is required currently in terms of our disclosure requirements. So the CSA has been publishing guidance to help companies understand requirements relating to environmental and climate matters and disclosure since 2010. So we've had a variety of staff notices that have been published, And those staff notices provide information about climate-related risks, how to disclose it, what would be expected, some suggestions. That is guidance, so that is not law. But what is proposed now, when it comes into force, will be law. So it's a national instrument, 51107. And again, as we've already mentioned, it was published in October for a 90-day comment period, and then that comment period has been extended until February. So before this becomes law, it goes out to comments. It is, we listen, we hear from industry and from investors as to what they're looking for. And we've asked a variety of very specific questions in the staff notice that publishes the proposed instrument, where we're looking for feedback from our issuers to help us shape the final form of these rules. And as part of the project, we did a disclosure review in the spring of 2021, where we looked at what's out there currently. So we had selected some larger issuers in a wide range of industries as part of our review processes at that point. So when we were doing that review, we were looking at what are people doing currently. So we're looking at how people's current disclosure relates to the guidance that's already published, focusing specifically on risk-related disclosure. And then we were looking for information that's currently in voluntary filings. Is there potentially material information that's in these voluntary filings that are omitted from the continuous disclosure filings? We were also very interested in the climate disclosure frameworks that people were using and the type of GHG emission metrics that were being used, and how many issuers were in fact disclosing climate matters and emissions matters. So we saw from based on the difference in 2021 from prior reviews, there was just tremendous improvement in terms of climate disclosure. No surprise, this is an area that has really a lot of investor attention. We still thought there was room for improvement. Now remember, this disclosure review was on large issuers. So it was not all issuers, not all Alberta issuers. It was large issuers across Canada from a variety of industries. But in the regulatory filings, we saw virtually all of them were disclosing climate-related risks, but less than 50% were providing information on board oversight of climate-related matters. And then we looked at the voluntary reports. Again, virtually all of these large issuers were providing climate information in voluntary reports, and most were in fact disclosing GHG emissions, scope 1, 2, 3, scope 1 and 2, or only scope 1. So we saw a lot of emissions, GHG emissions disclosure in those documents from these large issuers. We saw that most people, again, were using a disclosure framework, but because there's multiple frameworks available to report this information, that is what people were doing, is they were often selecting different measures or measures from different frameworks and then disclosing, not picking off everything in a particular framework, but just selecting a few things from each framework. So there was some cherry picking concerns that were noted there. So in our proposed rule, I wanted just to touch on the concept of materiality. So, and you'll have heard this in the prior session this morning if you were listening to the corporate finance session. We really focus on materiality when you look at what information should find its way into your security law filings. So unless disclosure is specifically required, and there are certain things that we just ask all issuers to disclose, tell us this, but other than specific required disclosure, materiality is the determining factor in whether to include information in your regulatory filings. And information is material if a reasonable investor's decision to buy, sell, or hold securities in an issuer would likely be influenced or changed if the information in question was omitted or misstated. So keeping materiality in mind when you're making these assessments. In terms of the proposed rule, so there's 4 core pillars. And these pillars they align with the pillars in the TCFD framework: governance, risk management, strategy, and metrics and targets. So for 2 of those pillars, there would be required disclosure. So there was a narrative in form, but it will be asking all issuers to provide information about those metrics, or about those pillars. And then for the other 2 pillars, strategy, metrics, and targets, we have said, if the information here is material, please disclose it. Information on GHG emissions is treated slightly differently, so I'll talk about that a bit more, but GHG emissions currently is a comply or explain framework.
Tanya, just before you get into the details of the 4 pillars, there's a question. Can you speak to the proposed timing for the final form of the NI 51107?
So, I mean, we're in the comment period now. The comments will come in, and then we will have an obligation to consider those comments and carefully consider the comments that have come in. And then the assessment of those comments will shape the final rule. I mean, we're working on this now. It's an important area for us. So there'll be a lot of work done on this rule in 2022. In all of our examples, you'll see that we give an example of if this rule came into force at the end of 2022, then here's how it would play out. But in terms of the timing, the actual timing of the rule, too early to say when it would come into force. Okay, so turning now to the aspects of the rule. So this is now required disclosure. So governance and risk management. And again, you'll see how when I was referring to that our rule is relatively general in nature, this is what the rule is asking for. Describe the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities, and describe management's role in assessing and managing those climate-related risks and opportunities. And then under risk management, describe the company's processes for identifying, assessing, and managing, and how are those processes integrated into the company's overall risk management program. So it's, this is narrative disclosure, but it will take work to pull this together in a way that will, need to be done in order to include it in your regulatory filings. You may need to assess board competencies around about climate-related matters. Is there director, maybe there's an impact on director education, you need to do something there. And board level decisions and oversight. So will climate-related oversight be at a board level or perhaps at a committee level? So sometimes we see that the HSE committee will have oversight of climate-related matters. The behind the scenes stuff, because the board and committee mandates will probably need to be amended and updated to take these things into account. And in terms of risk management, your company may have an ERM program, an enterprise risk management program, with a heat register, risk maps that talk about different risks to the companies and the severity and likelihood, and those that sort of thing may need to be updated as well. So behind the scenes work that will get the company ready to in fact provide this kind of narrative disclosure. Just on to the next slide. Oh, sorry, it flipped already. Okay, so under strategy, so these 2 are disclose if material. So describe the company's risks and opportunities over the short, medium, and long term, describe the impacts. and then metrics and targets, disclose the metrics used, describe the targets used. So this is where there is a materiality assessment applied by management. Are these disclosures relevant to our investors? Is this information that should be disclosed because it is in fact material?
Tanya, a couple of questions on this pillar. The first is, what is meant by climate-related risk? And then the second is, are short, medium, and long-term timeframes for risks defined?
Okay. So climate-related risk, if you look at one of the publications, a staff notice 51-358, there's a discussion there of what is meant by climate-related risk. And also, if you look at the TCFD recommendations, there's a very fulsome discussion there. So it talks about climate-related risks being risks related to global climate, including the ongoing policy response to these changes. So classifying risks as physical risks, which include risks associated with extreme weather events, and transition risks, which are risks such as reputational or regulatory challenges, and business risks associated with the transition to a lower carbon economy. So that is what is meant by climate-related risk. Sorry, what was, the long, short, medium, and long-term risks. So that's not defined in our rule, but again, if you look at the TCFD recommendations, they have short-term risks as being, less than 2 years, medium-term risks being sort of in that 5-year mark, and long-term risks around that 10-year period. And I've, in oil and gas, in some of the sustainability reports that I've seen, they use that approximate, that same kind of time frame. Sometimes I see short as under 5 years, medium 5 to 10, and long-term 10 years plus. But there is, if you look at those TCFD recommendations, they actually go into a bit of what would be a short, medium, and a long-term risk. And just on to the next slide. So here is where we get to the GHG emissions. Alternative, so the proposed rule puts out 2 alternatives for consultation. Oh, it's probably, CRA calling to tell me it's the legal department and I have to pay something. So disclose scope 1, 2, and 3 GHG emissions and related risks. So currently we have alternative 1, which is a comply or explain framework. So all 3 scopes, we ask for disclosure on all 3 scopes, but we give the issuer the opportunity to either disclose that information or explain why they haven't disclosed that information. And perhaps the explanation could be that we don't think that this information is material, or on scope 3 emissions, which is the upstream and downstream of the company, we're not yet evolved enough to have confidence in this data that we've collected or whatever. So it is a comply or explain framework. The second alternative that's in the proposed rule is disclose scope 1 emissions. And then there's an A and a B for that. So disclose scope 1 emissions when material, or B in all cases, and disclose scope 2 and 3 emissions on a comply or explain basis. So 2 potential alternatives are being consulted on, and this is one of the aspects that we have been receiving comments on from our issuers.
Tanya, one more question here. Can you give an example of when disclosure of scope 1 emissions would not be material?
I mean, I would think of that in a company that is outside of carbon intense industry. So maybe potentially like a technology company where you have some workers in an office, and they don't produce anything. So you think about if that's a publicly traded company, if you're an investor in that company, do you consider the emissions of that technology business or that consulting business to in fact be material? I don't know. I'm not sure that you do. We're nearing the end. Let's flip forward. This next slide is really just the summary slide so that you see it all on one page. A lot of words on one page, but just sort of outlining what's mandatory and what has a materiality threshold associated with it. And then just flip on. So I just also wanted to mention the location of the proposed disclosure. So the climate-related governance disclosure is proposed to be included in the same information that you would find information about election of directors at a shareholder meeting. So that would be in the management information circular. And if there's no management information circular distributed, then that information would find its way into the annual information form or an annual MD&A. The information on strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets, and that's where the GHG emissions disclosure would go, is in the annual information form. Otherwise, if there's no AIF, in an annual MD&A.
Just quickly wanted to note, because somebody had asked where those comment letters received to date are posted, because they couldn't find them on the ASC website, and that's true. Right. They're all on the Ontario Securities Commission website, and I think it's under like the instruments tab, and then you just search for 51107 instrument, and they'll all be found there.
Thank you. And just next slide, please. Oh, we're at the end. Questions. So any other questions that you have? We are almost out of time here. So to the extent that you do have questions, certainly put them in the Q&A box. If you submit them with your name associated, then we will follow up with you directly. Thank you.